Hello everyone, Reginald Scott here, and just want to make a quick video tonight if I can. I know I tend to talk a lot, so my videos are very rarely quick. Tonight I want to talk about cabling. So if you've got a mechanical group set, you have cables on your bike, and there are kind of three types of cable options out there for bike frames. You've got externally routed, where all the cables are on the outside of the bike. You've got internally routed or partially internally routed, where some of the cables, usually the exposed cables, are on the inside of the frame, either in the top tube or going down the down tube, but they still have the cable housing on the outside of the bike. And then you have the third option, which is the fully integrated cables in some bikes, where all the cables are internally routed, so they come through the shifters into usually carbon aero bars, through the bars into the stem, down the stem into the head tube, and then through the frame. So all the cables are internally routed. Now I have a preference. I prefer externally routed cables, and I'm going to explain to you tonight why I think, if you're buying a bike and you have the option, why I personally would choose externally routed cables rather than internally routed cables. Now, as far as I can see, there are two advantages to having your cables on the inside of the bike. Let's pretend for the moment that you have an internally routed bike that has got the exposed cables on the inside of the frame. The number one advantage out of the two advantages that I can see is aesthetics. Some people, not including myself, some people care very deeply about where the cables are on the bike. So therefore it's important to them that those cables are running down the inside of the bike, because it makes the bike look cleaner and it makes the bike look more modern in some ways. So for them, it becomes a bit of a bugbear when they see a bike with externally routed cables that they think, oh, I prefer it with internal cables, okay? Now the other thing, the other advantage, whether that one matters to you or not, it's not really a tangible advantage. The only other advantage is the only tangible advantage of having internally routed cables, and that is aerodynamic drag. So basically, if you've got your cables on the inside of the frame, then that is going to make your bike ever so slightly more aerodynamic. Now obviously a fully integrated bike is going to be more aerodynamic than a partially integrated cable system on a bike. To put it in perspective though, how much effect this will actually have on your performance, if you think how thin those cables are that are sitting on the outside of your frame, they're pretty thin, right? They're not actually going to create that much drag. In fact, the drag that they have on your bike is so infinitesimal, it's almost insignificant. Because when you look at it, 80 to 85% of your aerodynamic drag comes from your body. After that huge percentage of your body being about 80%, it's your wheels, whether your wheels are aerodynamically optimized or whether you have specifically aerodynamic wheels or not, doesn't matter. The next biggest factor in your drag is your wheels. And I think that is, I've seen different things. I've seen between 10 to 16%. It depends on what you read on the data out there, and I guess it depends on what kind of wheels were tested, but I've seen it makes up the percentage wise about 10 to 16%. And then the next one is your frame and your group set, and I've heard figures for your frame ranging about 4%. So only 4% of your total aerodynamic drag is from your frame. And if you think about the percentage of that drag that comes from your cables, well, we're talking about probably less than 1%, because you think of how thick and big your frame is. Even if you have an aero frame, you're only impacting on 4% of your total drag. So less, much less than the total 4% is coming from your cables. And I mean, I'm not including your bars and what kind of bar tape you have and what kind of group set that you have and all this other kind of stuff, right? And your bottles and your bottle cages and all that stuff. whether you have aero brakes or whether you have concealed brakes and all that kind of thing. So again, going back to the aero advantage of cables, it's so small, it doesn't actually matter. You're not going to lose a bike race because you have external cables. They don't matter that much. There are other things that you can do to your bike and your body that will save megawatts in comparison with the watts that you lose from your cables. So they're the two advantages of having internally routed cables. Let's get to the disadvantages, or the advantages of having externally routed cables, which I prefer. Okay, advantage number one, they're a lot easier to replace. As somebody who works with bikes a lot in my shop, I can tell you that an externally routed bike takes me about an hour and 15 minutes to fully recable. So that is all the inner cable, all the housing, all the ferrules, all the end caps and everything. The whole bike I can strip down of cables and recable in just over an hour. That's pretty quick. That's average. Average aero bike that comes in the shop that with all internally routed cables, I mean not even all internally routed cables, just sometimes a few cables that run through the frame, can take me like 3 hours. And that's not a joke. I mean, sometimes when you cock up and you pull a cable out that you shouldn't, or you physically can't get one of the tricks of recabling an internally routed bike to work, it can be a nightmare. So if you pay somebody else to do it, it's going to cost you more. And if you do it yourself, it's going to cost you more time. So that's, for me, advantage number one. I don't want to be spending 3 hours of my life recabling my bike when I can be spending 1 hour to recable my bike, or I can spend less money to get a bike shop to do it than giving it to a bike shop and then spending more money on them doing it. And if you think about it, if your bike is a real pain in the ass to recable, you will be giving it to a bike shop to do, because you literally will be like pulling your hair out, or you'll get halfway through it and you'll cock up and you won't be able to do it, and you'll be like, oh shit, I've got to send it to the bike shop now. So it's going to cost you more money, whichever way you look at it. So that's disadvantage number one. Financially and time-wise, it's harder to recable the bike. Number two, disadvantage or advantage of external, is that cables actually last longer with an externally routed frame. Now that sounds counterintuitive, because a lot of people think that external cables are exposed to the elements, so therefore they will rust and corrode faster. Not actually true, because most internally routed cable bikes are carbon bikes. A few aluminium bikes out there do it, but most metal bikes are external. Most are carbon bikes, and most carbon bikes retain a lot of moisture because they're usually very poorly vented. They're very poorly drained as well. So there's, like, for example, like Boardman aero bikes I get in the shop, they usually retain a lot of water and a lot of moisture, and that means your internal cables are constantly damp and they corrode very quickly. I've had brand new bikes come in the shop that have been stored poorly before they were sold, and I've had to replace the cables on the bike because the customer comes in and like they've got a brand new bike, their controls are like gravel, really gravelly and gritty, and it's because all the cables have actually just rusted. With external cables, they're open to the element, yes, but they dry faster and they don't stay damp because they're not sealed inside a tube with a load of moisture. The other thing, of course, is that a property of carbon fibre is that it reacts with metal. It galvanically corrodes with metal. So anywhere where you drill into the frame to take those cables, the cable lugs and the cable, end caps that are made of metal, and the cables themselves react with the carbon fibre, and that accelerates their corrosion. So again, not only will you find it more difficult to replace your cables, you'll have to replace your cables more often. So it's again going to cost you more money and time. So those are the two major disadvantages. Another disadvantage of internally routed cables is the holes in the frame. So when you drill a hole in something, you weaken its structure. And you actually, like, if you imagine a solid tube, like this one here, this is a solid carbon tube, but it could be anything. The stress that goes down this tube is going to be equal on all points of the tube. If I start drilling a hole here and a hole here in which to run a cable, when this tube twists under load or flexes under load, those two holes are going to become stress points where the stress doesn't move evenly around the tube. So bikes with holes in them, that have had holes drilled in them to run cables through, are going to react differently to stress than a solid tube bike that has a cable lug welded to the outside or stuck on the outside, right? So you get a better stiffness from a solid tube than you will a tube with holes in it. So you get a better ride, you get a better ride quality from a bike without holes in it. And also, I've noticed people who have internally routed handlebars, when they crash or when those handlebars fail for whatever reason, whether they're cheap eBay bars or whether they've just had a previous damage to them, 9 times out of 10 they break right on the holes. So on your aero bars where you've got that little hole that you run the cables through, I've got a set of bars in the shop right now. On both sides of the bar, it's split right on that hole. So again, running the cables through the bike, it increases the likelihood of a break on that point, and it also reduces the stiffness of the frame. Another issue of internally routed cables is it ruins your gear changing performance and your braking performance, because all those cables, especially if they run completely through your bars and completely through your stem, have to take very sharp turns, and the cable housing, because of that, gets quite badly stretched and stressed and bent, and that affects your gear changing. I've noticed that I had a set of aero bars on my bike previously. I got rid of them because I didn't like them. They actually flexed too much, like bird wings. But this is actually a subject for another video about why I wouldn't buy aero bars. But I've actually gone back to traditional bars, and I've noticed my shifting has improved, and that my shifting decreased, or my shifting smoothness decreased, when I had internally routed cables, because they're bending more. So you bend a cable, you end up putting more stress, more strain on it, more friction, and it doesn't shift as well. So your shifting goes bad. So that's one thing. And also, when you're passing those cables through the bike, sometimes the little holes, the little carbon fiber holes are sharp, and they can strip the plastic protection off the cable housing, which then allows water to get in, and that water corrodes your cable housing quicker. So again, you end up having to replace things more often because of that damage. Because of the disadvantages of having internal cabling, I would rather go for external. I don't care about the aesthetics, and we can clearly see that the aerodynamic advantage is virtually zero, or so close to zero that it doesn't make an impact on whether you win or lose a bike race, so it shouldn't really matter. Other factors like your fatigue, your fitness, your mood on the day, whether you got enough sleep, all that kind of stuff is going to matter way more than whether you have internally and externally routed cables. But like I say, the advantages of having them on the outside are: 1, easier maintenance, cheaper maintenance, quicker maintenance. Oh, here's another one. They don't corrode as fast, and you get better gear shifting. That's 5. I thought of one more, which I'd actually forgotten. So another thing is that if your cables are inside the bike, you can't see when they're damaged or corroded. You don't actually know, and sometimes it doesn't always show up in the feeling of the cable, especially if the cable's starting to fray for whatever reason inside the bike. Say it starts to split. Because it's internally routed, you can't see that. Where external cables, if there's an issue, you're more likely to see the issue. So if that fraying or damage or rusting is occurring to your cables inside the frame, you won't know until A, you take the bike for service, or B, something happens. Whereas if they're external to the bike, you can see that. So that is 6 things that you get that you're better off with, as opposed to 2 things you're better off with internal. So internal, you get 2 advantages, external, you get 6. So for me, I tend to look at things kind of logically, and I'm a bit of a utilitarian. I believe in the greatest amount of good for the greatest number of people or for the greatest purpose. And I think I'd rather have 6 advantages than 2 minor advantages. And one of the advantages of internally routed cables is purely aesthetics, which matters naught. So to some extent, unless it affects you mentally, like you physically don't ride well because you hate the way your bike looks, that can be a potential problem. So there you go. That is why I personally prefer my cables on the outside. But that's just me. You don't have to have it that way. You don't have to agree with me. Everybody's different. So, and if you've got another reason why internally routed cables are better that I haven't thought of, stick it in the comments below, because I really racked my brain about it, and they're the only 2 I can come up with. It looks better, and maybe there's some aerodynamic advantage, but probably not. As usual, thanks for watching. And as always, stay safe, everyone. Thanks.